How's it going, everybody? It's Sam here, and welcome back to the Morbid Veil. Today, we have a story of war, bloodshed, and redemption. But first, if you haven't seen our previous build, then click the pop-up now to view it. Now, without any further delay, let's take a stride down the pilgrim's path of Magnus the Great. Riften, the city of thieves, a place so corrupt, even the Jarl is nothing more than a puppet on a string. The Blackbriar family is one of, if not the most powerful family in all of Skyrim. However, not many know how dark this family truly is. Maven Blackbriar was young when she developed her ruthless and cunning reputation. In order to inherit a large portion of land and money, Maven seduced one of her older cousins. He laid with her, but as she was only 16 at the time, she was able to convince everyone that he had taken her by force. Outraged, her father publicly beat the boy half to death before the guards pulled him away. Maven's father was the executor of his deceased brother's estate until his son turned 25, and that was the estate Maven coveted. While her cousin laid in the dungeon, bruised and broken, Maven's plan continued to grow inside of her. She was pregnant, and when her father learned of this, he had the original documents of his brother's estate brought to him. It read, "If my son should die before his 25th winter, then my estate shall immediately be passed to the mother of his firstborn child." Unknowingly, Maven's father continued to play into her hand. He contacted the Dark Brotherhood and had his nephew assassinated in the Riften jail. Of course, it looked like an accident, but many speculated that the rest of the Blackbriars had something to do with it. 7 months later, Maven went into labor. She was ruthless indeed, but even she could not imagine a more unbearable pain upon someone else. For 15 hours she was in labor, until finally her child was born. There were mixed feelings throughout the family, but Maven did not care, and continued her facade. She named her son Hemming, and a great celebration was held at her new estate. A few months went by, and though Maven had the land and home she wanted, she was not happy. Taking care of her son was more of a hassle than she realized, and even with her servants helping her. Maven contacted the Dark Brotherhood, and when the assassin arrived, she told him that she wanted him to dispose of her son. The assassin was hesitant, but the Black Sacrament had to be obeyed. He took the child and disappeared into the night. But rather than killing the child as Maven wanted, the assassin used her own words against her. He disposed of the child, taking him to a couple he knew right on the border of Cyrodiil. The couple gladly took the child in, and for the next 18 years raised him as their son, who they named Magnus. When the Great War broke out, Magnus signed up with the Imperial Legion, determined to fight back against the Aldmeri Dominion. Though he was young, he was fierce, and wielded a sword like a true master. However, the elves were the masters of the arcane arts, and so they used their magic to defeat Magnus and his fellow soldiers. He was taken captive along with the others and held prisoner of war for the next 2 years. During that time, Magnus found himself falling for one of the guards, Taryn, an Altmer girl who was only 1 year older than himself. She was tasked with feeding the prisoners, but she always made sure to make time to sit and speak with Magnus. Taryn told Magnus that she was forced to join the Dominion by her mother, Elenwen, and that she only wanted to live in the woods, possibly on a farm. Magnus promised her that once the war was over, they would run away together and find a farm where they could be happy. Only a few months before the war ended, the other prisoners planned an escape. During the commotion, Magnus fled and searched the camp for Taryn. But when he found her, it was too late. One of the legates who had been captured had run her through with his blade. Rage filled Magnus, and he unleashed a powerful bolt of magic from his hands that disintegrated the legate. Though he was terrified at what he had just done, Magnus was more focused on Taryn. He ran to her and held her in his arms. She touched his cheek and smiled, and told him that he was a good man, and that she was glad that she had gotten the chance to know him. Magnus was terrified of losing her, and so he tried to heal her, but no magic emanated from his hands. She pulled herself closer to him and kissed his lips before taking her final breath. Magnus's sorrow lasted but a few moments, and turned into a boiling rage. He grabbed a sword and began killing every single Imperial and Dominion soldier he could. By the end of the night, the moonlight shone upon a blood-drenched ground, and only Magnus was left standing. Shaken by what he had done, he dropped the sword and vowed that he would never take up arms again. Magnus then made a bed with cloth and twigs and laid Taryn's body on it. He grabbed hold of it and began walking back home. Nearly a week went by before Magnus reached his home, and as he approached the old cottage, he saw smoke billowing from the tree line. He ran to the house, still dragging the bed which Taryn was laid on. When he arrived, he was devastated. His mother and father's corpses had been burnt to a crisp, and the scent of Altmer magic tainted the air. Magnus fell to his knees and cried out. For hours he screamed to the heavens, until his voice was lost. Later that evening, he buried his family and his beloved Taryn. The war had cost him everything. His sorrow soon became a burning hatred. He hated war, he hated the Empire, he hated the Dominion, and he hated the gods. They could have stopped all of this pain and suffering. They could have prevented the war and prevented the death of his loved ones. He cursed the divines, and as he did, he was struck by lightning. When he awoke the next morning, he could see nothing. The divines had stripped him of his sight, and he continued to curse them. For over 20 years, Magnus wandered through Tamriel, blind and furious at the gods, until one day, as he slept along the road, a woman sat beside him and spoke. Her voice was soft like a spring rain. Her very presence warmed the frigid air. She told Magnus that the gods were trying to teach him to rely on them, that if he came to them, they would bless him. Magnus scoffed and told the woman to leave, but she touched his cheek gently, and his sight returned. Tears filled his eyes, as before him sat Taryn, gleaming with a soft orange light. She smiled at him and said goodbye. Magnus got to his knees and began praising the names of the divines. He got to his feet and prepared to make a pilgrimage to their shrines. However, his plans were interrupted by the sound of battle. He looked over just in time to see an arrow flying at him. He narrowly missed it and prepared to flee. The next thing he remembered was a shield coming from behind a tree, knocking him unconscious. Days later, he awoke on a cart being taken to his execution. He prayed that the divines would deliver him from this grim fate, and so they did. A mighty dragon appeared from nowhere and saved Magnus's life. To escape Helgen, whether he wanted to or not, he was going to have to fight again. Spill blood again. Now for the skills. After escaping Helgen, Magnus finds himself covered in blood. He had broken his vow. The trauma of that night flashed before him, and he knelt down and made a new vow. He would not raise a weapon against any of the innocents, or for anyone who fights for so-called glory. He remembers the power he had used that night so long ago, and so he taps into the power of the Mage Stone and begins honing his skills of the arcane arts. He heads to the College of Winterhold, where he masters many new spells. As he leaves the college and continues to travel across Skyrim, he runs into many situations where he's forced to fight in close combat. Magnus saw no other way, and so he sought out trainers to help aid him in learning how to fight in combat once again. Though he trains to use weapons again, Magnus refuses to wear any armor, and so he continues to wear robes and common clothes, which he places various enchantments upon. Now let's talk about what Magnus does use to combat his enemies. After becoming the Archmage of Winterhold, Magnus wears the Archmage's robes, as well as a silver moonstone circlet. He also wears a pair of common gloves and mage boots. His gloves, boots, necklace, ring, and circlet all have powerful enchantments which he placed on them himself. Magnus uses a unique sword in combat which he named Silver Peace. It's enchanted with absorb health and chaos damage, ensuring that enemies will die before their blood has a chance to taint his robes. And now for the gameplay. After the events of Helgen, Magnus decides that he must go on a pilgrimage to every shrine of the divines, and pray to each one to cleanse his soul. This becomes a very common thing for him to do, as Magnus goes to the shrine again every Sundas to purify his soul. He does his best to help others, but greatly detests bloodshed and only takes on such quests if they are absolutely necessary to ensure the safety of another person. When in combat, Magnus will use long-distance spells to dispatch his enemies. Depending on their strengths and weaknesses, he will switch between fire, frost, and shock spells. As the enemies get closer, he'll place a rune and spell wall, then retreat a few meters. His ally, Mule, will fight off the enemies as Magnus focuses on healing her during battle. Should there be too many to fend off alone, Magnus will say a quick prayer to the divines before drawing his sword and fighting alongside his ally. And now for the timeline. After discovering that he is the legendary Dragonborn, and that the only way to increase his power is to slay dragons, Magnus heads to the College of Winterhold to hone his magical abilities. Through great study and trials, he becomes the greatest mage of all Skyrim, which eventually leads to him becoming the Archmage of Winterhold. With his newly developed powers, Magnus sets out to slay as many dragons as he can before they destroy Skyrim. He quickly realizes that the great beasts are getting stronger. He aids Delphine in finding Esbern, and it is there in Riften where Magnus meets the beautiful Mule, the Lioness. He retrieves her sword from a dwarven ruin, and from there the two help Delphine and Esbern in reforging the blades, and together they take down even mightier dragons. However, the war against the dragons becomes too great, while the civil war also rages on, and Alduin must be dealt with. Magnus speaks to the leaders of the civil war and convinces them to come to High Hrothgar to negotiate a truce so he may defeat the World Eater. Delphine and Esbern demand that Magnus slay Parthenax first, but he cannot. If anyone knows what it means to be redeemed, it's Magnus and Parthenax. He refuses to kill the old dragon and heads to Whiterun. Once Alduin's been defeated, the civil war doesn't take long to start back up. However, Magnus cannot choose one side or the other. He ignores the civil war as best as he can, and returns to Riften as he believes the Thieves' Guild may have some magical artifacts in their possession. When he arrives, he sees an orphanage and decides that perhaps it would be better to start a family. Not long after walking into the orphanage, he hears Grelot the Kind threatening the children with extra beatings. His blood begins to boil with rage, and without thinking, he draws his sword and beheads Grelot right there. As he stands over the old woman's body, his blood runs cold. He killed someone in front of the children, and instead of them screaming, they begin to laugh and praise the Dark Brotherhood. He leaves the orphanage and immediately sets out on a pilgrimage to cleanse his soul. After his soul is purified, he meditates on that night and recalls hearing one of the children mention an Aventus Aretino. He decides to investigate and finds Aventus Aretino in Windhelm, performing the Black Sacrament. He tries to explain that he's not with the Dark Brotherhood and that the child shouldn't revere them, but the boy will not listen and pays Magnus with a family heirloom. Not long after, Magnus receives a mysterious note. He shrugs it off and returns to Winterhold and rests. He awakens in a strange cabin with a member of the Dark Brotherhood taunting him, demanding him to kill again. Magnus speaks to the three captives and discovers that the Khajiit is the most likely the one to have the bounty on his head. Instead of killing him, Magnus attacks Astrid with potent magic. She dies, and Magnus flees to Solitude to inform the Emperor's Guard of the Dark Brotherhood. Magnus is instructed to destroy the Dark Brotherhood, and he does so. Not one of the members in the sanctuary is left alive. From there, Magnus hears rumors of vampire attacks becoming more frequent. He joins the Dawn Guard, and together he quickly destroys Harkon and the Volkihar clan, and brings order to Skyrim. Not long after the destruction of the Volkihar clan, Magnus is forced to face Miraak. The cultist attacks became much more frequent, and they risked killing the innocent whenever they attacked. Magnus heads to Solstheim and is surprised to find Daedric magic influencing the entire island. He works with Master Neloth and the Skald to free Solstheim of Miraak's power, and eventually they succeed. The stones are freed of Miraak's corruption, and it finally comes time for Magnus to face off against the fallen dragon priest. They fight one-on-one, and at the end of the battle, Magnus witnesses Miraak's death at the hand, or rather tentacle, of Hermaeus Mora. The Daedric prince tries to claim Magnus as his new champion, but as before, when he came to him with the Augma Infinium, Magnus rebukes him. Magnus had finally settled down in the beautiful home of Mirwatch. With his wife Mule the Lioness, they raised their adopted daughter, Sissel. Together, the family lives in peace and harmony, until the day that the war came to their doorstep. No one knew where Magnus had gone, but one of Ulfric's men discovered his whereabouts. He demanded that Magnus help them in the war, but Magnus refused. The Stormcloak general would not take no for an answer, and attacked. Magnus was wounded, but he would not submit. Mule tried to help, but Magnus placed a protective barrier to keep her and Sissel inside. The Stormcloak went for another hit, but Magnus threw up a ward and pushed the general back. Magnus called out to Odahviing, and his ally came to his call. The dragon tore the Stormcloak in two and waited for Magnus. Knowing that the war would continue unless drastic action was taken, Magnus climbed on Odahviing's back and headed for the throat of the world. As Magnus healed himself at the top of the mountain, 36 dragons arrived, and each dropped a member of the Blades by Magnus's side. Delphine demanded to know what was going on and why a dragon had kidnapped them from the temple. Magnus explained the situation, that the war needed to end before it killed everyone else. He told her that he planned to head to Cyrodiil and take the dragon throne. By taking control of the Empire, he could command General Tullius to stand down, and send envoys to speak with Ulfric. Delphine refused to help the Dragonborn, pointing to Parthenax and demanding that he be killed first. The old grey dragon spoke, but Delphine refused to listen. Esbern, who heard the words of Parthenax, shed a tear for the dragon. He stepped forward and agreed to serve Magnus. As the other Blades knelt before Magnus, pledging themselves to him, Delphine stormed off and called them all fools, saying that she would not serve a dragon sympathizer. Odahviing offered to kill her, but Magnus said no, and Delphine walked back down the mountain to Riverwood. With an army of dragons and the Blades, Magnus climbed on the back of Odahviing, and they all flew to Cyrodiil. The horns sounded, and many archers and mages took a fighting stance, but they were baffled when they saw men and women riding on the backs of the great beasts, and not one dragon attempted to scorch their lands. Magnus entered the White Gold Tower and proclaimed that he is the last Dragonborn, and that by right of birth he shall sit upon the throne as Emperor. Titus Mede II was terrified, as there were dragons resting upon the tower, soaring through the skies, and a small legion donning Akaviri armor were marching behind Magnus. While some in the Emperor's court tried to object, Titus Mede held up his hand to silence them. He acknowledged that Magnus does indeed deserve to sit upon the dragon throne, and that he would be happy to step down. He only asked that he be allowed to live so that he may witness his cousin's wedding in solitude. Magnus agreed, and Titus ordered that a pair of royal robes be placed upon Magnus, and a crown signifying his new authority. As Magnus sat on the dragon throne, the dragon fires were ignited, and a thundering voice came down from the heavens, proclaiming that the dragon dynasty had been restored, and that all would prosper under Magnus's reign. Odahviing took Titus Mede II to solitude, and 12 other dragons returned to Skyrim, each bringing news of Magnus's ascension to the dragon throne. Ulfric was dumbfounded at the words the dragon spoke to him, and General Tullius would not have believed it if Titus Mede II had not been flown to solitude on the back of a dragon. Immediately, Tullius sent word to his legates to cease operation, that the new emperor was calling for an immediate end to the war. Ulfric reluctantly submitted to the dragon, who told him the same, and a week later, Emperor Magnus called a meeting at High Hrothgar. He proposed that either Ulfric and Elisif marry and the two rule Skyrim as equals, or he will place a new High King above them both. Both refused, and Magnus ordered them to be stripped of their titles. Windhelm was placed under a new Jarl, and Jarl Balgruuf was made the new High King of Skyrim, whilst his brother became Jarl of Whiterun. The Thalmor did not take long to act against the new emperor, and demanded that he adhere to the White Gold Concordact. But he refused, and as the Thalmor began a new war against Magnus the Great, they quickly fell into submission. Odahviing, Paarthurnax, and the Blades wiped out the Thalmor. The remnants of the Aldmeri Dominion were informed that they may serve the 8 divines, but those who choose to serve the 9 can maintain that right. For 100 years, Magnus the Great ruled over Tamriel. On the day that he passed away, there appeared in the heavens a new glowing sphere. Many took to calling it New Magnus, the plane of order and compassion. And to this day his descendants rule over Tamriel, each ensuring that peace will last until the end of time. We hope you all enjoyed our most recent build, Magnus the Great. If you haven't already, please hit that like button, subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified of our next video. Have a great rest of your week, everybody, and we'll see you all here next time on The Morbid Veil.